Michael Henderson stared at his reflection in the executive washroom mirror, adjusting his silk tie with trembling fingers. At 53, he had everything a man could want: a successful position as chief financial officer at Reynolds and Blake investment firm, a beautiful home in Boston's prestigious Beacon Hill neighborhood, and a family that was the envy of his social circle. Yet the face that looked back at him seemed hollow, aged beyond its years by the weight of secrets he'd carried for the past 6 months. His phone buzzed again, another message from Sandra, his wife of 28 years. He ignored it, just as he'd been ignoring the growing distance between them. The real message he was waiting for would come from another number, one that had become both his salvation and his curse. "Mr. Henderson?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board meeting starts in 5 minutes. I'll be right there, Julie." His voice remained steady, masking the turmoil beneath. Professional composure had become second nature, a shield against the chaos threatening to breach his carefully constructed world. As he walked through the corridor of power where he'd spent the last 15 years building his career, Michael noticed things he'd overlooked before: the slight hesitation in his colleagues' greetings, the whispered conversations that ceased as he approached, the way Tom Barrett, his longtime friend and fellow executive, avoided eye contact during their brief encounter. The board meeting proceeded as usual, but Michael's mind wandered to the email he'd discovered on Sandra's laptop last weekend. It had been an accident. She'd asked him to print some documents for her charity event while she was at yoga. One notification pop-up was all it took to unravel the tapestry of trust he'd believed in for nearly 3 decades. The Q3 projections look promising, CEO Richard Blake's voice cut through Michael's thoughts. "Wouldn't you agree, Mike?" "Absolutely," Michael responded automatically, grateful for his years of experience that allowed him to function on autopilot. The Asian markets particularly show strong potential for growth. As the meeting continued, Michael's thoughts drifted to his son, Mark, who'd recently moved back home after his own divorce. The irony wasn't lost on him, his son seeking refuge in a house that was becoming its own battlefield of unspoken grievances and hidden agendas. Later that evening, as Michael drove home through Boston's rush-hour traffic, his phone rang. The number he'd been waiting for finally appeared. "We need to talk," the voice on the other end said without preamble. "Things are moving faster than anticipated." "I understand," Michael replied, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "Same place?" "No. Too risky now. I'll text you the new location." "And Michael? Make sure you're not followed this time." The call ended, leaving Michael alone with the sound of his racing heart and the steady hum of his Mercedes engine. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed Sandra's car was missing, though she should have been home hours ago. Another lie in their growing collection. Inside, he found Mark in the kitchen, warming up leftover lasagna. His son's presence was both a comfort and a complication. "Hey, Dad," Mark looked up, his eyes carrying shadows of his own struggles. "Mom left a note. Said she's at another fundraising committee meeting." Michael nodded, the familiar taste of bitter resignation on his tongue. "How was your day?" "Found out Claire's getting remarried," Mark said, his attempt at casual betrayed by the slight tremor in his voice. "To the guy she said not to worry about." The parallel wasn't lost on Michael. Like father, like son, both men standing in their pristine kitchen, their lives unraveling in eerily similar patterns. But while Mark's story was written in broad daylight, Michael's was playing out in shadows and whispers, in encrypted emails and clandestine meetings. His phone buzzed again, the promised text with a new location. As he read it, his heart nearly stopped. The message contained something else, something that changed everything. "Sandra knows. Watch your back." Michael looked at his son, suddenly aware that he wasn't the only one caught in the crossfire of what was coming. The carefully constructed facade he'd maintained was about to shatter, and the fallout would affect everyone he loved. But maybe, just maybe, that's what needed to happen for the truth to finally emerge. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made both men look up. Sandra's headlights swept across the kitchen walls, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for them like accusing fingers. Michael's phone buzzed one final time. Tomorrow. Noon. Don't be late. Everything changes after this. As Sandra's heels clicked against the walkway, Michael made a decision. The weight of silence had become too heavy to bear. But before he could speak his truth, he needed to ensure he understood the full scope of the lies that had brought them all to this moment. Tomorrow would change everything, he just wasn't sure if he was ready for what those changes would reveal. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows, casting a deceptively peaceful glow over the breakfast scene. Michael watched Sandra prepare her usual morning smoothie, her movements precise and practiced. 28 years of marriage had taught him to read the subtle language of her body, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided his gaze while maintaining a perfect facade of normalcy. "The Thompson Charity Gala is this weekend," she said, her voice carrying the same polished tone she used with her social circle. "I trust you'll be there." "Of course," Michael replied, studying her face for any sign of what she might know. The warning from his mysterious contact echoed in his mind. Sandra knows. But knows what? The full truth, or just fragments that could be even more dangerous? Mark shuffled into the kitchen, his presence a reminder of how their family's facade of perfection had begun to crack. His son's divorce had been the first breach, forcing them all to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes love wasn't enough to hold things together. "Dad, got a minute?" Mark asked, his expression unusually serious. "There's something I need to show you." Michael followed his son to the study, aware of Sandra's eyes tracking their movement. Inside, Mark closed the door and pulled out his phone. "Remember my friend Steve from college? He works in digital forensics now." Mark's voice was low, controlled. "I asked him to look into something for me after Claire left. He found, well, you should see for yourself." The screen displayed a series of email exchanges, ones that made Michael's blood run cold. They weren't Sandra's emails that he'd glimpsed last week, these were far more damaging. "Where did you get these?" Michael's throat felt dry. "That's not the important question, Dad." Mark's eyes held a mix of concern and disappointment. "What matters is what you're going to do about Reynolds and Blake cooking their books. And why your signature is on documents that don't match the official records." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. His son had unknowingly stumbled upon the very thing that had been consuming Michael's life for the past 6 months. The corruption he'd discovered, the evidence he'd been carefully gathering, the reason for his clandestine meetings, it all threatened to explode into the open before he was ready. "Mark, this is..." Michael began, but his phone buzzed with a text message that made his heart skip. "Meeting moved up. 10 a.m. Bring what you have. They're making their move." A knock on the study door made both men jump. Sandra's voice drifted through the wood. "Michael. Richard Blake is here. He says it's urgent." Father and son exchanged looks of alarm. Richard Blake never made house calls, especially not at 8:30 in the morning. "Tell him I'll be right there," Michael called out, his mind racing. To Mark, he whispered, "Delete those emails from your phone. Now. And whatever happens next, stay away from the office today." "Dad, what's really going on?" Mark's voice carried the same fear Michael had heard when his son was small and afraid of monsters under his bed. But this time, the monsters were very real. "I promise I'll explain everything," Michael said, gripping his son's shoulder. "But right now, I need you to trust me. And..." He hesitated, the weight of his next words heavy on his tongue. "Watch out for your mother. I'm not sure whose side she's on anymore." In the living room, Richard Blake stood by the fireplace, examining the family photos on the mantel. His presence was like a shark in a swimming pool, sleek, dangerous, and completely out of place in this domestic setting. "Mike," Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry to drop by so early, but something's come to my attention that we need to discuss. Privately." Sandra hovered near the doorway, her face a mask of polite concern that didn't quite hide the calculation in her eyes. The morning sun caught the diamond on her finger, the ring Michael had given her on their 25th anniversary, bought with money that now felt tainted. Of course, Michael replied, matching Richard's tone. My study. As they walked down the hallway, Michael caught a glimpse of Mark at the top of the stairs, watching with worried eyes. The study had always been Michael's sanctuary, but now it felt like a trap slowly closing around him. Richard closed the door behind them, his demeanor shifting from polite to predatory in an instant. We need to talk about Geneva, he said without preamble. And about your meetings with the SEC. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Through the study window, Michael saw Sandra getting into her car, her movements unhurried, deliberate. She looked up at the study window, and for a moment, their eyes met. In that brief connection, Michael saw something that chilled him more than Richard's words, recognition. Not of the man she'd been married to for 28 years, but of the stranger he'd become in the past 6 months. She raised her hand in what might have been a wave or a warning, then drove away, leaving Michael to face the consequences of choices made in shadows, surrounded by people he no longer trusted. His phone buzzed one final time. Don't say a word. Help is coming. Hold on. But as Richard Blake pulled a thick file from his briefcase, Michael wondered if help would arrive in time to prevent the implosion of everything he'd spent his life building, and whether any of it was worth saving anymore. The thick manila folder landed on Michael's desk with a sound like distant thunder. Richard Blake's manicured fingers rested on its surface, but Michael's eyes were drawn to the small red label in the corner, Project Geneva. You've always been smart, Mike, Richard's voice carried a note of what might have been genuine regret. That's why I'm giving you this chance. For old time's sake. Through the study window, Michael watched his son pace in the garden, phone pressed to his ear. Mark's gesture of frustration, running his fingers through his hair, just like he did as a teenager, made Michael's chest ache with a fierce, protective love. 28 years of marriage, Richard continued, settling into the leather chair across from Michael. That's impressive. Almost as long as Jennifer and I were together before she passed. He paused, studying Michael's face. Did you know Sandra was the one who came to me first? The words hit Michael like a physical blow. His mind raced back through recent months, Sandra's late-night phone calls, her increased involvement in charity work, the subtle changes in her behavior. Had he been so focused on protecting his family that he'd failed to see the threat from within? She was worried about you, Mike. The late nights, the secretive meetings, the changes in your behavior. She thought you were having an affair. Richard's laugh held no humor. Imagine her surprise when our internal audit revealed something far more interesting. Michael's phone vibrated in his pocket, but he didn't dare check it. Richard's eyes hadn't left his face. Here's what's going to happen, Richard leaned forward. You're going to sign a resignation letter. Cite personal reasons, health concerns, whatever narrative helps you sleep at night. In return, certain documents, he tapped the folder, never see the light of day. Everyone wins. And if I refuse? Then Mark's promising career in finance ends before it begins. Sandra's reputation in the charity circuit becomes complicated. And those SEC meetings you've been having? Let's just say two can play at that game. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Michael thought of his son's divorce, how Mark had emerged stronger from that betrayal. He thought of Sandra, wondering if her actions were driven by concern or calculation. Most of all, he thought of the evidence stored in his personal safe at the office, evidence that went far beyond what Richard suspected. His phone buzzed again. This time, he risked a glance. In position. Create distance. Now. Years of working in high-stakes finance had taught Michael to keep his expression neutral, even as his pulse quickened. I need time to consider my options. You have until noon, Richard stood, straightening his tie. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Mike. For everyone's sake. As Richard left the study, Michael heard Sandra's car pulling back into the driveway. Through the window, he watched her emerge, carrying a familiar leather briefcase, one he hadn't seen since his early days at the firm. The sight sent a chill down his spine. Mark intercepted her in the driveway, their conversation hidden by the morning breeze. But their body language told a story: Mark's defensive stance, Sandra's hesitation, the way she clutched the briefcase like a shield. Michael's phone lit up with another message: package secured from office. Sandra has the backup. Trust in no one. The irony wasn't lost on him. For months, he'd been gathering evidence of corporate fraud, working with SEC investigators, all while believing he was protecting his family. Now, standing in his study watching his wife and son in what looked like a confrontation, he wondered if he'd been playing the wrong game all along. He opened his safe, removing a single USB drive, his insurance policy. The documents it contained would destroy not just Richard Blake, but half the board of directors. What he hadn't known until now was whether the cost of justice would be worth the price of betrayal. Sandra entered the house, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors. Mark followed, his face set in lines of determination that reminded Michael of Sandra in their younger years. The sound of their approach felt like a countdown to detonation. His phone buzzed one final time. Sandra has proof of Blake's involvement in Jennifer's death. She's been building her own case. Time to combine forces. Michael stared at the message, pieces falling into place like a deadly puzzle. Jennifer Blake's death 2 years ago, ruled a suicide, had been the catalyst for his own investigation. Now, watching his wife approach with evidence he never knew she had, Michael realized that perhaps the greatest betrayal would be continuing to fight this battle alone. The study door opened, and Sandra stepped in, Mark close behind. Her eyes held a storm of emotions: fear, determination, and something else, a fierce love that had weathered decades of secrets and silence. "We need to talk," she said, placing the briefcase on his desk. "All of us. About Jennifer Blake, about Geneva, and about what happens at noon." Mark closed the door behind them, standing guard like a sentinel. "Dad," he said softly, "whatever you're involved in, whatever the truth is, we face it together." Michael looked at his family, seeing them not as liabilities to be protected, but as allies in a war he'd been fighting alone for too long. The weight of silence lifted, replaced by the heavier but more hopeful burden of shared truth. His phone buzzed one last time, meeting moved to 11. "Bring them all. Time to end this." Outside, storm clouds gathered over Boston, promising a tempest that would either wash away their foundations or reveal the bedrock of truth beneath decades of carefully constructed lies. Sandra's hands trembled slightly as she opened the briefcase, but her voice remained steady. The morning light caught the silver strands in her hair, strands that had appeared during those long nights 2 years ago, when she'd held Jennifer Blake's hand in the hospital, listening to secrets that would change everything. "Jennifer knew," Sandra began, spreading documents across Michael's desk. "About the offshore accounts, about Geneva, about everything. She'd been gathering evidence for months before." Her voice caught. "Before they made it look like suicide." Michael felt the weight of his own secrets pressing against his chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" "The same reason you didn't tell me about your SEC investigation." Sandra's eyes met his, decades of shared life flowing between them. "To protect the people we love." Mark stood by the window, his lawyer's mind already connecting the dots. Jennifer Blake's death was ruled suicide by overdose. But these medical reports. He lifted a page from the pile, scanning it with growing horror. The toxicology results were altered. "Richard didn't just kill his wife," Sandra's voice hardened. "He killed my best friend. The woman who trusted me with evidence that could destroy everything he built. And I've spent 2 years playing the grieving friend, attending his charity galas, watching him celebrate while Jennifer's truth remained buried." Michael reached for his wife's hand, remembering countless dinner parties where she'd smiled and chatted with Richard Blake, each moment a silent tribute to her lost friend. The strength it must have taken, the depth of her loyalty, it humbled him. The Geneva project wasn't just about cooking books, Michael added, pulling out his USB drive. It was about weaponizing people's financial data. Medical records, personal histories, everything that makes someone vulnerable, all of it harvested through our investment algorithms. That's how they controlled Jennifer, Sandra's voice shook. They threatened to expose her history of depression, her teenage suicide attempt, everything she'd overcome. She was going to blow the whistle anyway, but then they made it look like she'd relapsed, Mark finished, his face pale. God, Dad, how deep does this go? Michael's phone buzzed, forces in position. Blake making moves. Watch your backs. Through the study window, they watched a black SUV pull up outside their house. Tom Barrett stepped out, Michael's longtime friend and colleague, the man who'd been avoiding his gaze at the office. Tom's been working with me, Sandra explained, seeing Michael's confusion. He was Jennifer's brother. After her death, he took a job at Reynolds and Blake to help me gather evidence. He's our contact with the FBI. The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. Tom's strange behavior, the awkward encounters, it hadn't been betrayal, but protection. A deeper loyalty at work. His phone lit up again, second team in place at the office. Sandra's evidence completes the puzzle. Time to move. Mark's phone chimed simultaneously. Claire's calling, he said, staring at the screen in disbelief. She says she has information about Blake's overseas accounts. Says she's been working as a forensic accountant for the FBI task force. The pieces clicked into place, Claire's sudden divorce from Mark, her new job, the mysterious man she was seeing. She hadn't betrayed their son, she'd been protecting him, working undercover to gather evidence that could bring down the entire corrupt enterprise. Sandra opened her briefcase again, removing a final folder. Inside was a letter, written in Jennifer's flowing hand, dated the day before her death. She knew what was coming, Sandra's voice cracked. She made me promise to wait, to gather everything needed to ensure justice would be complete. Not just for her, but for everyone they'd hurt. The sound of more cars arriving drew their attention. Through the window, they watched FBI vehicles taking positions around their home. Tom Barrett approached the front door, his badge now visible on his belt. Michael's phone buzzed one last time, Blake en route with legal team. Thinks he's coming to negotiate. Doesn't know about Jennifer's letter or Claire's evidence. Time to end this. Sandra touched the wedding ring Michael had given her, its diamond catching the light. I couldn't tell you everything, she whispered. Just like you couldn't tell me. We were both trying to protect our family, our futures. She smiled sadly. Jennifer used to say that the strongest hearts are the ones that break and heal together. Mark's phone rang again, this time displaying his father's private investigator's number. Dad, he said, his voice urgent, remember when you hired James to investigate Claire's affair? He's been working with the FBI too. Says he has recordings of Blake discussing Jennifer's death. Actual confessions. The sound of Richard Blake's Mercedes pulling into their driveway echoed like a death knell. Michael looked at his family, his wife, stronger and braver than he'd ever imagined, his son, standing tall despite the weight of revelations crashing down around them, Tom Barrett approaching their door, carrying the badge of justice his sister had died pursuing. Together, Michael said, gripping Sandra's hand. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Sandra squeezed his hand back, her eyes fierce with determination. For Jennifer, she whispered. For all of us. The doorbell rang, its chime carrying the weight of endings and beginnings, of secrets finally surfacing, of justice long delayed but never denied. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Boston, promising to wash away years of carefully constructed lies, leaving only truth in their wake. The moment Richard Blake stepped into their home, the air changed. Michael felt Sandra's hand tighten in his, drawing strength from the connection they'd rebuilt in the past hour. Through the window, rain began to fall, each drop a quiet witness to the unfolding scene. "I see we're having a family reunion," Richard's voice carried its usual smooth confidence, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty as he registered Tom Barrett's presence. "Though I don't recall inviting the FBI to our little discussion." Sandra stepped forward, and Michael saw in her stance the quiet strength she'd carried all these years, the same strength that had sustained Jennifer Blake through her darkest moments. "We're done playing your games, Richard. Jennifer deserved better than this. Better than you." The name hit Richard like a physical blow. For a moment, his carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing something raw and dangerous beneath. "You don't know what you're talking about, Sandra." Jennifer was troubled. Everyone knew that. "No," Sandra's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Everyone knew what you wanted them to know. What you carefully constructed to hide the truth." She opened Jennifer's letter, her hands steady now. "But Jennifer knew what you were planning. She knew about Geneva, about the data mining, about everything. And she made sure the truth wouldn't die with her." Mark moved closer to his mother, his presence both protective and supportive. Outside, more FBI vehicles arrived silently, their lights off but their presence unmistakable. "You're making a mistake," Richard's hand twitched toward his phone. "Think about what you're doing to your family, Sandra. To your reputation. Everything you've built in the community. Stop." Michael's voice cut through the room. "You don't get to threaten my family anymore. Not after what you did to yours." Tom Barrett stepped forward, his FBI badge catching the light. "Jennifer was my sister, Richard. Did you really think I'd let her death go unanswered? That any of us would?" Richard's composure slipped further. "Tom. You've been, all this time. Ever since you had her killed." Tom's voice carried years of contained grief. "She called me that night, you know. Told me everything. About the threats, about Geneva, about how you'd used her medical history against her. She was finally ready to fight back." Sandra touched the envelope containing Jennifer's letter. "She wasn't alone in that fight. Not really. Even if she felt that way at the end." Through the window, they watched Claire emerge from one of the FBI vehicles, carrying a briefcase of her own. Mark's breath caught at the sight of his ex-wife, understanding finally washing over his features. "She knew," he said softly. "Claire knew what was coming. That's why she pushed me away, to protect me from all this." Richard's eyes darted between them, calculating, searching for weakness. "Whatever you think you have, it won't be enough. My lawyers." "Your lawyers can't help you anymore," Tom interrupted, holding up his phone. "The Geneva servers were seized an hour ago. Everything, the surveillance programs, the blackmail files, the offshore accounts, it's all being decrypted as we speak." Sandra opened Jennifer's letter, her voice strong and clear as she read, "If you're reading this, they've already done what they threatened. But remember what you promised me, Sandra. The truth doesn't die with us, it lives in the choices we make, in the love we protect, in the justice we fight for." More FBI agents entered the house, their movements precise and professional. Richard's face had gone ashen, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Jennifer kept a diary, Sandra continued, each word a stone in the foundation of truth they'd built. Every meeting, every threat, every detail about Geneva, she documented all of it. She knew you were monitoring her electronic devices, so she wrote it all by hand. Gave me one page at a time, over months of our lunch dates. Michael watched his wife, seeing her in a new light, not just as his partner of 28 years, but as a warrior in her own right, fighting a battle he'd never fully understood until now. "Dad," Mark's voice was quiet but firm. "Claire's here. She wants to talk." Through the rain-streaked windows, Michael saw his former daughter-in-law approaching the house, her FBI vest a stark contrast to the elegant suits she'd worn during her marriage to Mark. She carried herself differently now, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. The sound of handcuffs clicking around Richard's wrists echoed through the room like a final punctuation mark. But as they led him away, Sandra turned to Jennifer's letter one last time, reading the words that had waited 2 years to be heard. The hardest part isn't the dying, Sandra. It's living with the weight of silence. Break that silence. Not just for me, but for everyone whose truth has been buried under the weight of power and privilege. Remember what we used to say? The strongest hearts are the ones that break and heal together. Your heart, my friend, was always the strongest I knew. Outside, the storm intensified, but within the house, a different kind of cleansing was taking place, one built on truth, justice, and the unbreakable bonds of love that had sustained them through their darkest hours. 6 months after Richard Blake's arrest, Michael stood in Jennifer Blake's garden, now tended by Sandra with the same care she'd given to preserving her friend's final truths. The autumn air carried the scent of late-blooming roses, Jennifer's favorites, Sandra had told him, because they defied the expected seasons. She would have loved this, Sandra said softly, kneeling to brush soil from a memorial stone. Justice, yes, but more than that, the healing that came after. The garden had become their sanctuary in the months following the trial. A place where broken pieces could be gathered and reformed into something new, something stronger. Michael watched his wife's hands move among the flowers, remembering how those same hands had held Jennifer's truth safe for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to let it bloom. Mom. Mark's voice carried from the garden path, where he stood with Claire, their fingers loosely intertwined. The past months had weathered them both, but there was a new strength in their connection, one forged through shared purpose rather than shared silence. Claire stepped forward, her FBI badge now worn openly on her belt. The final sentencing hearing is tomorrow, she said. They want us all there, everyone whose truth helped bring down Geneva. Michael felt the weight of the past 6 months settle around them. The investigation had revealed depths of corruption beyond even their worst suspicions. Dozens of families like Jennifer's, silenced through elaborate schemes of financial manipulation and personal data exploitation. But with each revelation came healing, not just for them, but for every life touched by Reynolds and Blake's web of deceit. Tom called earlier, Sandra added, rising from the garden with quiet grace. He's bringing Jennifer's diary to the memorial service next week. Said it belongs with her roses now that justice has been served. The mention of Tom Barrett brought a mix of emotions. He'd resigned from the FBI after the case closed, choosing to honor his sister's memory by establishing a foundation for corporate whistleblowers. The Jennifer Blake Truth Foundation, they'd named it, a beacon for others trapped in webs of institutional silence. I've been thinking about what Jennifer wrote, Mark said, his arm gentle around Claire's shoulders. About the strongest hearts being the ones that break and heal together. Claire and we're proof of that, aren't we? Claire's eyes met his, carrying the weight of their shared journey. We had to break apart to fight the right battle, she said softly. But coming back together. That was the real victory. Michael watched them, seeing echoes of his own journey with Sandra. The months of therapy, of lengthy conversations that stretched into dawn, of learning to trust not just each other's love but each other's strength. They'd all carried their own pieces of truth, thinking solitude was the price of protection. Now they understood that true protection lay in standing together. Sandra touched the locket at her throat, a gift from Jennifer that now held a small photo of them together, smiling at some long-ago charity event. Jennifer used to say that gardens teach us the most important lesson about healing, she mused. That new growth requires both sunshine and rain, both breaking and becoming. The sound of more cars arriving drew their attention. Other families were gathering for the weekly support group Sandra had started in the garden, people whose lives had been touched by Geneva, now finding strength in shared healing. Michael saw their son straighten, preparing to share his own story of rebuilding trust with Claire, of choosing love over fear. Dad? Mark's voice carried a hint of his childhood vulnerability. "Remember what you told me the day everything came out? About facing truth together?" Michael nodded, drawing Sandra closer. "Family isn't just about protecting each other," he said, the words carrying new depth. "It's about trusting each other to be strong enough for the truth." As the garden filled with voices of healing and hope, Michael reflected on the cost of silence and the price of truth. They'd lost the facade of perfection, the comfortable illusion of their manicured life. But in its place, they'd gained something far more precious: authenticity, resilience, and a love strengthened by shared battles. Sandra's hand found his, their wedding rings catching the late afternoon light. In her eyes, he saw not just his wife of 28 years, but his partner in a deeper truth, that real love grows stronger through adversity, that family bonds deepen through honesty, that healing happens not in isolation but in connection. The memorial stone caught the fading sunlight, Jennifer's name etched in lasting tribute. Around it, her roses bloomed out of season, defiant and beautiful. Like truth itself, they emerged when they were ready, not when expected. And like the family gathered in this garden of healing, they grew stronger for having faced both storm and sunshine together. Above them, the Boston sky cleared after a passing shower, a rainbow arching over the garden like nature's own testimony to the beauty of breaking and becoming. In this moment of quiet grace, surrounded by the family he'd almost lost and the truth they'd fought to protect, Michael finally understood what Jennifer had meant about the strongest hearts. They were all proof of it, every person in this garden, every story of survival and renewal, every truth finally spoken aloud. Their hearts had broken together, and together they had healed, stronger at the mended places, more beautiful for having been broken open to the light.